A year ago, I posted this video, which shows the method of quickly creating a 3D model with quad topology. It's quite a simple technique, but I think because the video is quite short, a lot of beginners became confused. And that's why I've decided to make this longer version with more explanation. So this video consists of two parts. First, I'll go over the basics of every modeling technique used in the video. And then the second part is the modeling of the robot seen in the thumbnail with voiceover narration. I just want to make sure you understand that this is just a fun modeling technique for quick ID generation. I'm not saying that this is how you should model robots or anything else. In fact, if you want to use a proper workflow, I recommend that you first create some drawings or a really rough blockout, because drawing is the fastest way to create ideas. And that way you can quickly go through the bad ideas and then pick the good one, without having invested lots of time in 3D modeling. Then you can create a 3D blockout, and for this blockout version you can use all the modeling shortcuts and methods that you can come up with, like booleans with terrible topology, it's all fine. And then as the final stage, you can start making the production ready model with proper topology and all that. So if you want to learn more about that entire workflow, check out my hard surface modeling course. However, the method described in this video is also fine, and sometimes I think it's fine to just have some fun making 3D stuff. The advantage of this technique is that it's fun and fast and you get all quad topology, so it's easier to add some cool sci-fi details with alpha brushes in sculpt mode and to do things like adding panel cuts. Keep in mind that to make pro-level 3D art takes many hours, and there are no real shortcuts. So in other words, if you're looking to make a serious piece for your portfolio, or for a game or animation that you're making, then definitely use the method from my hard surface modeling course. And if you just want to have some fun and model a quick robot in less than an hour and learn some modeling basics while you're doing it, then keep watching this video. So with that long disclaimer out of the way, let's continue and look at all the modeling techniques used in this process. First of all, the way this works is by adding two different subdivision modifiers to a cube. The first one is set to simple, and the second one is set to Catmull-Clark. Now, some quick explanation about both of these algorithms. Catmull-Clark is the default method of subdividing in Blender. It not only doubles the amount of geometry, it also makes the model more smooth. By default, Blender won't display all this new geometry, but if you disable optimal display, you can see it. However, I recommend that you keep optimal display turned on. The simple subdivision algorithm only doubles the amount of geometry without smoothing it. By combining these, you get this result. Note that it's important that the simple subdivision is above the Catmull-Clark one. You can see the difference if I swap them. Oh, and by the way, you can move modifiers in the stack by clicking on this and dragging them up or down. In object mode, right-click on the cube and choose Shade Smooth. Now the model looks better. You can also click on the viewport shading drop-down and choose a matte cap. That way it looks a bit more interesting in the viewport. This is not a texture or a material, it only affects how you see things in the 3D viewport of Blender. When you increase the levels of the simple subdiv modifier, you'll get a more blocky shape. However, I recommend keeping it at a level of 1 and adding sharper corners later by adding geometry to them manually. Don't worry, we'll look at how to do that later in the video. By adding a mirror modifier, you make sure that whatever you do on one side also happens on the other side. However, it's always best to drag the mirror modifier to the top. And enable bisect on the mirror modifier. Bisect basically adds a loop in the middle, although you don't see it with optimal display enabled, and it removes the other half, so you don't end up with any overlapping geometry. Alternatively, you can add a loop cut with Ctrl-R in edit mode and manually delete half of the object. If you do decide to delete half of the geometry, you don't need to use the bisect option. But in my example, I'm just going to use bisect. When you switch to edit mode, you can edit the geometry. However, as you can see in edit mode, you don't see only the smooth model, but also the original unsmoothed geometry. By enabling the On Cage button, that's this button here, you can work directly on the smooth model in edit mode. Make sure optimal display is also enabled to make it look more clean and so that you're not distracted by all the extra geometry. Let's look at some basics of modeling. In edit mode, you can select vertices, edges, and faces. If you select a face and then press E, you can extrude it. You can also use the Extrude tool from the tool panel for this, but I think it's worth learning these shortcuts as Extrude is such a common tool that you're going to be using it a lot. If you don't see the tool panel, press T to toggle its visibility. You can drag on it to expand it and to see the names of the tools. As you can see, Extrude is a very powerful tool because it quickly adds more geometry. You just move the mouse to determine how far to extrude and then you left click to confirm. But be careful, if you right click, you only cancel the transformation of the extruded part. In other words, you only cancel moving the extruded face, but not the extruding by itself. That means that you now have got vertices that are in the same location as where you extruded from. So you've got double geometry in that case. So make sure you press Ctrl Z to undo if you want to cancel an extruded face. After extruding, you can scale down the selected extruded face by pressing S and moving the mouse. Or you can rotate it by pressing R. This is especially useful in combination with one of the axes of the 3D world, the X, Y, and Z axis. For example, press R and Y to rotate on the Y axis, or R and X, or R and Z. You can achieve the same by using the rotate tool and dragging the red, green, or blue handles. A very similar tool is the Inset tool. In fact, in some other 3D software, Inset and Extrude are just one tool. Press I and move the mouse. You've now created Inset geometry. By pressing S for scale, you adjust its size. Or you can adjust the strangely named thickness value in this panel. By the way, if you adjust the depth value, you'll see that it's really the same as Extrude. In fact, if you inset by pressing I and then press Ctrl and move the mouse, you actually extrude the selected face. If you select more than one face and inset it, you can toggle whether you want to inset both together or individually by pressing I again. Or you can toggle the individual box in the tools options. By the way, if you accidentally close this panel because you clicked somewhere, press F9. I recommend if you're a beginner that you use E for extrude and I for inset. And then later, when you're more experienced, you can just use the inset tool for both insetting and extrusions, as it's a bit more advanced and has more options that way. Another very powerful tool is loop cut and slide. Usually this is referred to in tutorials as add a loop or add an edge loop, because that's what it does. It adds a loop of edges. The keyboard shortcut for this is Ctrl R. You left click to confirm adding the loop of edges, and then you can move the mouse to position the new loop. Then left click again to confirm its placement. Here too you can still adjust it in its own option menu. You can also add more than one loop by increasing the number of cuts, either in this panel or after Ctrl R by scrolling the mouse wheel up. But in this video we'll only ever add one loop, so just leave that number of cuts at 1. Adding loops means that you have smaller faces to extrude, and it also gives you more geometry to manipulate. For example, you can go to Edge Selection mode and select an edge or several edges by holding Shift, and then move them by pressing G. You can also use the Move tool and its green, blue, or red handles, or press G and then X, or G and Y, or G and Z to move only on those axes. And you can also scale the selection with S and rotate with R. You can do the same thing with vertices by going to Vertex Selection mode. Adding loops is also useful for making edges sharper. The closer edges are together, the sharper that corner will be. That's how the smoothing algorithm works in subdivision modeling. When you've added a loop and you want to move it at some later point, the way to do so is by sliding it. To slide a loop, select the loop by Alt and left clicking on it, or go to Select Loops, Edge Loops, and then press G twice. Now when you move the mouse, you slide the selected loop along the geometry that it's on. As you can see, sliding a edge loop makes the corners that it's moving closer to sharper. Just make sure that you don't bring it too close. If you want to remove a loop, select it with Alt and left click, and then press Ctrl X to dissolve it. Or go to Mesh, Delete, Dissolve Edges. Or just press Delete on your keyboard and choose Dissolve Edges. Those are the very basics of modeling, but here are a couple more things. The Loop Tools extension is essential for modeling in Blender, so make sure that you install it. You can find it in Preferences by searching for the Loop Tools extension in the Extensions tab. After installing it, you can right-click on a selection in Edit mode and, for example, make it circular. Another super handy thing you can do with loop tools is easily flatten a selection. But if you want to flatten something along a specific axis, you can also press S to scale, then the axis that you want to scale on, and then 0 on the numpad and enter. So for example, S, Z, 0 and enter to flatten a selection on the Z axis. If you want to quickly create another piece of the model that already has all these modifiers, select a face or several faces and press Shift D to duplicate them, and then extrude the selection to give it some thickness. Press Ctrl and plus on the numpad to grow the selection, and then G to move it if necessary. Oh, and by the way, if you want the viewport to look like this, besides enabling a matte cap, you can enable cavity and then play with the settings until it looks good to you. Just like with the matte cap, this is not a material or a texture, and it only looks this way in the 3D viewport of Blender. Before we continue, I should mention that instead of the first simple subdivision modifier, you can also replace that one with a bevel modifier for a similar result. The advantage of that is they have a bit more control over the corner sharpness, so that's definitely also a useful way to do it. In my opinion, the downside is that you cannot enable on cage, so you cannot really see exactly what you're doing in edit mode. So it really depends on what you personally prefer. However, I find that once you've extruded more geometry, the bevel method becomes less reliable. So I recommend using the double subdivision modifier method instead. If you like, you can also display the wireframe in object mode by enabling it on the object itself in viewport display options or globally in the viewport overlays. However, I don't recommend doing this because you might get confused and think that you're in edit mode when you're in fact in object mode. And those are all the modeling tools that you will need for this easy, fast modeling technique. So now let's look at an example project. At the end of the video, we'll look at a few more advanced methods of adding finer detail. So this is the part where I show you how to model this specific example. As you can see, I have two 3D viewport windows open, both with the default cube. I just had the one on the right open so that I could record a time lapse of the process, that's all. So the window on the left is the one that I'm actually working in. And I'm adding a subdiv modifier and I'm setting it to simple. So that's the first one, it's just adding more geometry. And then I'm adding another one set to Cadmore Clark. And then I'll right click and choose Shade Smooth. So now the cube looks more smooth. So in this case, I decided to turn on wireframe display in object mode. I don't actually recommend that you do this, but I just did it in this example to show the wireframe. And here I'm showing you the difference. If you turn off optimal display, then you see all that extra geometry. But I recommend that you just keep optimal display turned on. And then I'm adding a mirror modifier and I'm dragging it up and enabling bisect. And as you can see in edit mode, we can still see the original geometry unless we turn on cage, which is this triangular icon. And as you can see now, you see this optimal display. It's very clean and there's no distracting extra geometry to look at. And so in edit mode with face selection mode, if I want to move a face on a specific axis, I just press, for example, G and X to move it only on the X axis, or G and Y to move it on the Y axis, and G and Z to move it on the Z axis. And instead of face selection mode, you can also use edge selection mode and then just move edges and adjust the shape like that. And now I'm going to add some extra geometry by pressing Ctrl R, which is the way to add a loop cut. And then I'm just adjusting this specific edge by sliding it on the y-axis. And here I'm extruding this by pressing E. And then again in edge selection mode, I'm just manipulating some edges, just moving them on the y-axis and the z-axis here. And same with this one, I'm just moving it up on the z-axis. And yeah, because we have such a clean display of the geometry, because optimal display is enabled and on cage is enabled, we can manipulate the geometry very easily and we're not distracted by any geometry that we don't need to see. And now I'm just selecting these two faces and pressing E to extrude and then S to scale down. And again, E to extrude, and then I'm just scaling it to 0 on the x-axis and just moving and scaling on the specific axes just to manipulate the shape, and rotating it on the y-axis here. And selecting some more faces and extruding with E, and then scaling down on X. And as you can see, we're very quickly getting an interesting shape. Let's select these two and inset them with I, and then extrude inwards with E, and you're getting this kind of interesting intake. And when we switch to object mode, you see actually all the geometry that is being generated. So you can kind of inspect what you're creating in object mode because wireframe is turned on. But I actually don't recommend leaving wireframe turned on for an object because it can be confusing. It can look like you're in edit mode and you might press a button that you're expecting to do something in edit mode, which will do something else in object mode. So here I used Loop Tools Flatten, as you can see, just to flatten those faces. And now I'm just manipulating that shape by moving some edges on the Z-axis and just selecting these faces and insetting them once more with I and just scaling that a bit, and then with E extruding that again and scaling the extrusion down slightly. And I'm gonna select one face in the front here and extrude it with E and then scale it on the Z-axis with S and Z, and also move it on the Z and then on the Y-axis. And then we're going to just move some edges here. And so it's very easy to very quickly manipulate the shape just by moving some edges or some faces. And let's extrude this part here. So I'm extruding this on the Z-axis and then scaling it down on the Z-axis as well. And that flattens it. And then we can kind of rotate this from the side view here and just manipulate it by scaling it and rotating it and moving it to get a more interesting shape there for these, I don't know, neck guards, I guess. Now here I'm actually going to select this and then Shift D and duplicate it. And then I'm going to press G and X to move it on the X-axis, to move it away from the model. And so now I have a piece of geometry which has still all of these modifiers. But when I press B and then choose Separate by Selection, I actually turn it into a separate object. Now we have a separate object, and in edit mode, we can extrude it to give it some thickness. And the reason that that other object now has so many edges is just because we're seeing that one in object mode and we're seeing the small arm piece in edit mode. So in edit mode, you're only seeing the simplified geometry, the optimal display. And when something is not selected, you're seeing all the geometry that's there. And so I'm just manipulating that shape and moving some edges, and then Control R, adding a loop and sliding it so that that part becomes a bit sharper there. And the same thing on the other side. So, and then I'm just going to select some of these edges at the top here, and then double G and sliding them, and then we can extrude these faces. And I'm just going to adjust the shape a bit more by selecting and sliding some edges with G and G, so double G. And that will slide it along that geometry. And I'm just selecting this face and moving it on the Y-axis a bit, just to give it a bit more of a rounded shape here in the front. And then extruding those faces and scaling that down, moving that selection on the X-axis. And let's take these two faces here on the side and inset them with I, and scale that down a bit, and then extrude it inwards so we get this kind of hole here. And let's take these two and extrude them as well and scale it down on the Z-axis. Then we flatten it and then we just scale it down. And let's move these edges and let's switch to vertex mode so we can just manipulate this one vertex here to bring that a bit closer on the X-axis. And sometimes you just need to have only the vertex selection mode so you can do a bit finer work. And here at the bottom I want to extrude some faces, but first I'll add another loop with Control R. And then I can just select this part and inset that, and then I can extrude it inwards. And then Shift D and duplicate that part and separate by selection to create a new object. And then we can extrude and we can add thickness that way. And then we can just, of course, manipulate it in the same way as all the other objects. So scale, rotate, and move on specific axes. And this is very low poly now, so I'm just Control R adding another loop and sliding it. And then I can select these two faces and extrude them and maybe scale that down a bit and move it on the Z-axis. And every time you extrude and inset, you create more smaller faces that you can manipulate and extrude or inset. So it's really kind of an iterative process where you kind of organically create these shapes and you go from big to small. And so here I'm just manipulating some vertices to have a bit more control over the shape. And just like with edges, you can double G and slide these vertices along that geometry. And to flatten these three faces, I'm scaling them to 0 on the y-axis, and that flattens them. And so now we're in object mode, and in object mode, you just click on an object to select it. You can also select two objects and then go to edit mode, and you can manipulate both of them at the same time. And now to create the head, I'm just selecting these two faces here, Shift D, duplicating them and moving them up on the Z-axis a bit, and then pressing P and choosing separate by selection to create a new object. And then in edit mode, we can select these faces and press E to extrude them in order to create some thickness. And by the way, you don't have to separate things into separate objects, but it can be useful because it is a bit more efficient. And especially if you're going to add detail with sculpting, then it really helps in terms of keeping the scene optimal, especially if you don't have a very good computer, if you just work on one object at a time. And so here I'm just thinking a bit about how I'm going to edit the head, because I'm just sort of improvising the shape. So I'm just adding some more geometry and manipulating some edges, and just Control R, adding more loops. And so I'm just moving some edges and trying to create an interesting shape. And here I actually applied the mirror modifier and just remove that middle edge there. And that allows me to extrude a bit more easily in the middle of the object here. And so here I'm extruding this part in the front. And then I'm also going to make a selection in the back and first inset that, and then just move that a bit. And yeah, you can see how similar extruding and insetting is. It's pretty much the same thing really. So here I'm creating some kind of interesting head shape and extruding this part in the back. And of course, scaling that down and manipulating some edges to make sure that the silhouette looks better. And so I usually use GG, so double G, to slide edges along the surface. And yeah, just double G sliding and then moving along the Z-axis, this edge. And in vertex selection mode, moving some vertices, or you can also scale them towards each other. And because I don't have a mirror modifier anymore, when I manipulate one side, then as you can see, it doesn't change the other side. However, we can turn on X symmetry, and then if you make a change on one side, it will also happen on the other side. You just have to make sure you choose the correct axes. For example, now we're using the X axis. And here I'm just insetting and extruding again. But you can see most of this is just insetting and extruding parts. There's really not much more to it than that. Unfortunately, for some reason, Symmetrize only works with geometry that is already there. So if you inset or you extrude, then for some reason it won't do that on the other side. And that is why here I symmetrize it. And normally Symmetrize is a tool that you find in this menu here. However, I've added it to my quick favorites. So now when I press Q, I can just choose Symmetrize and it will be right there. And it will work on all of the selected geometry. So you have to make sure that the geometry you want to symmetrize is selected. So I will press A and then choose Symmetrize. And sometimes you have to change the direction like I had to do here. So now the mesh is symmetrized and it is also added a loop in the middle, as you can see. And here I am insetting and extruding inwards. So I'm creating this kind of helmet shape. And now I'm creating another object by selecting these two faces and Shift-D duplicating them, and then separating by selection and extruding that part just to create something to put inside of the helmet of the head. And it looks like it's a bit off center, so I'm just selecting everything in edit mode, and then G and X to move it slightly more to the center there. And then in object mode, I'm just moving it up. Now here I want to actually select the two faces at the back of this object. So what I do is I select the two faces in the front, press Ctrl and plus on the numpad to grow the selection. So now only those two in the back are not selected. And then I press Ctrl and I, which inverts the selection, and that way the two faces at the back are selected. So now I can manipulate them. So I'm just moving them on the Y-axis and on the Z-axis. And so now I can manipulate this shape a bit more by selecting some edges and moving them. And again, I'm selecting two faces here and Shift-D duplicating them, separating by selection, and then extruding that part in order to get some thickness. And here, to create a bit more interesting of a helmet shape, I'm just selecting this edge and moving it on the y-axis. That way it's a bit more curved in the front. And as you can see in my object mode quick favorites menu, I also have the mirror modifier. So you can actually add modifiers with your quick favorites. And so I'm adding a mirror modifier back to this face part. And then of course, dragging it up to the top of the stack and enabling bisect. And there's something wrong in the middle here, but I think it's solved easily by just moving it a little bit. And then it will merge because the merge option is enabled. And so now I'm just manipulating that shape a bit more and insetting and extruding some parts. And that always works better with the mirror modifier on it, because then you don't need to symmetrize it manually. And so here I'm rotating these cheeks along the Z-axis just to make the shape a bit more fitting for the helmet around it. And I don't like the shape from the side, so I'm just gonna adjust this helmet a bit more. So I'm just gonna select these faces and move them on the Z-axis down like this. And I'm gonna just select these two edges and scale them away from each other on the X-axis to make that part a bit thicker. And then we can inset and extrude this inwards to create some kind of air intake or something. And we can do the same thing here, but first I'm just moving this inwards a bit to create a bit more space. Then we can select these faces and inset them and extrude inwards. And just move that extrusion a little bit to the side. And we have another air intake on the side of the head there. So I'm imagining this is the kind of technology from the 80s science fiction where there are a lot of capacitors and wires and stuff that need to be air cooled. And that's why it has a lot of air intakes. And here I'm just extruding the front of the helmet a bit more just to make it look more interesting. And we can create some air intakes here as well by insetting it and extruding inwards with E. And we need to always move that inset a bit because it will inset along the normal direction, which is usually not what you want in this case. So just move it with G and then some axes like G and X, G and Z, G and Y. Now you don't have to do this, but what I did is select everything and then Control A and choose Visual Geometry to Mesh. That applies all of the modifiers, and as you can see, it gives you a lot of geometry. And that just makes it a bit easier to do smaller details. And here I'm just turning off all those wireframe displays on all these individual objects. And as you can see, I added a shiny matte cap to the object there. So I've added a subdiv modifier back to this helmet part. And I'm just sliding some edge loops now to make those corners sharper. So the closer edge loops are together, or vertices are together, the sharper that part will be. I'm just double G and sliding these parts and then just making that part a bit sharper. And here I'm just turning on cavity to make sure that I can see the corners better. And another thing you can do is if you select an edge loop, you can bevel it with Control B and then scroll up to increase these segments. And then you can select the loop in the middle and scale it down with Alt S. And that creates a kind of a panel cut. And here I'm doing the same thing. So I'm selecting a loop, Control B to bevel it, and it still remembers the amount of segments. And then select that middle loop and Alt S and scale it down. And that's how you can get these interesting panel cuts. And here I'm adding a couple more loops around it just to make it more sharp. So having this kind of quad topology makes it really easy to select those loops. And here I'm also doing the same thing again. So adding a couple of loops here and Control B beveling it, selecting the one in the middle, and then just Alt S and scaling it down. So to add a bit more detail to the front of the face here, I'm selecting and insetting and then extruding this part and extruding it one more time and then insetting it one more time to make that part a bit more sharp. And here I'm adding a loop just to make that sharper as well. And then adding some loops and scaling the middle one down. And then adding loops around it to make the corners sharper. So I've added a panel cut around that as well. And here I'm beveling one vertex with Control Shift B. So Shift Control B. And then you can change the shape, first of all, to make it more circular. And you only need 2 segments. And you can use Loop Tools Circle, or you can just change the shape like that. And then I'm connecting these vertices by pressing J and insetting the circle part and extruding it inwards to create a nice circular hole there. And to make it a bit more circular, I'm using Loop Tools Circle because I manually made it round and it didn't really work out. So now it looks better, I think. And to create a bit more detail on the front here, I'm also just selecting these faces and then insetting it with I and extruding it inwards and extruding one more time. And then we get another kind of intake for the front of the helmet there. And adding a loop to make it a bit sharper. And adding another loop and then scaling that one inwards so that we get another panel cut there. And so now I'm switching to sculpt mode. And I'm just appending some alpha brushes from my hard surface sculpting course. So these are already pre-made brushes that I made specifically for that course. But if you don't have the course, you can find alpha brushes that are free quite easily online. If you just search on Gumroad, for example, or ArtStation, then you can probably find a lot of free hard surface alphas. And I made a video describing how to use those as well that you can watch on YouTube. And as you can see, we need a lot more resolution on this object. So I'm just going to subdivide this multi-res modifier that I put on it. And I still need to subdivide it more. So for these kind of things, for these alpha brushes, you really need a lot of resolution. You can see here, I turned on the statistics. You can see that this object alone has more than 3 million vertices. And you can see that when we move the camera, it disappears. And that's just Blender's way of keeping it more efficient. And it looks like I forgot to turn on symmetry. And so placing alpha brushes is pretty easy. You can change the radius with F, and you can rotate with Control F, and you can change the intensity with Shift F, and that's really all you need. And then you just place them on the surface somewhere. So I'm just placing some alphas, and as you can see, that really quickly adds more detail. You just have to make sure that you turn on X symmetry if you want it to be symmetrical. And I think it's really fun to experiment with these alphas because it's just so satisfying to see all that detail being generated. The cool thing about these alpha brushes, besides obviously that you can quickly generate a lot of detail, is that you just have to make them once. If you make them yourself, so of course you don't have to, you can just buy them. But if you make them yourself, you have them forever. So you just need to make it once. And then you can add that detail to any surface forever, any model you make. And in sculpt mode, to switch to another object, you press Alt Q. And as you can see, the multi-res detail on the middle object there on the torso disappeared. But it's still there. It's just hiding it to make it more efficient because that's like more than 3 million vertices. And so now I'm subdividing this part to 700,000 vertices and adding some detail to that. And in the viewport, you don't see the multi-res detail on the other object unless you turn on the viewport levels. But when you render it, you do see it, of course. So that's just Blender's way of making sure that you can use all these millions and millions of vertices quite efficiently, even on an old computer. And so yeah, here I'm just adding a few more details to the shoulder part here. So if you're placing something and you're not happy with the placement, you can always press Escape. That is the fastest way to exit an alpha brush. But if you've already placed it and you want to undo it, then just press Ctrl Z. It just takes a few more seconds to undo it. So if possible, press Escape if it's not too late. And if it's too late and you want to undo it, then just press Ctrl Z. But I've made several videos also on YouTube about alpha brushes, and I'll put the links to those in the description so you can check that out. And so here I'm Alt Q and selecting that part, the face part, and I'm adding a multi-res modifier and just subdividing it immediately because I know I will need several levels. And I'm going to add some detail to that. And as you can see, it's still not high enough resolution, so I need to increase the levels to 4, and that's already better. If you turn on smooth shading, that also helps. That makes it that you don't require quite as many levels of subdivision, because it's kind of faking that smoothness. So you don't quite see those jagged edges. But as you can see, I really need more subdiv levels here. And especially for these little details like these bolts. Keep in mind in Blender that symmetry is turned on per object. So you might be happily sculpting on an object thinking that X symmetry is turned on when it actually isn't. So you really need to check that every time. And so here I'm going to try and render this. So what I'm doing is I'm turning up the levels of the viewport display of the multiverse modifier, so we can see the multiverse detail on all of the objects at the same time. And of course you can go much further, add much more detail, but I'm just quickly going to make a render here, so I didn't spend too much time on it. And so I've appended the drag and drop materials from my materials course here, because it's just easier. You can just slap them on anything. You don't need to UV unwrap it or anything like that. So here I'm just enabling an HDRI. And that little checkbox you saw here, the HDRI checkbox, and this panel where you can cycle through HDRIs, is the Gaffer add-on, which is a free add-on. And all these HDRIs are also free. And it's quite great. It's by polyhaven.com. I think that's how it's still called. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And I've made a couple of videos about it as well. But it's very easy. You just install it and then you can check that box and get amazing lighting just for free. These materials are intended for cycles, by the way, because some of the edge detection shaders and stuff like that don't work in Eevee. Normally they're a bit faster if you turn on GPU, but it looks like I forgot to turn on GPU here. So it's just CPU rendering the viewport, which of course is very slow. And yeah, I'm just sort of experimenting, dragging and dropping. So with these materials, just a quick plug for my course, these materials you can just drag and drop on anything. You don't need to UV unwrap it, so they're perfect for sculpted objects, objects with lots of angons, high topology, low topology, doesn't matter. They will always work, and you just need to drag and drop them. And if you don't like it, you can drag and drop another material right on it, and it will just replace it. So I cannot make it more easy to use than that. That's really the most easy to use. And that course also shows you exactly step by step how to make those materials, and how to make textures, how to do everything you need to know to make those kind of materials, really. And normally they're not this slow, but yeah, I forgot to turn on the GPU, so they're a bit slower now. So I made these materials because I was just tired of always having to do this work in Substance Painter. Although I always enjoyed using Substance Painter, but I just find it a little bit difficult to use because, yeah, you always have to export your model, then you have to UV unwrap it, even if it's a crappy decimated sculpt, you still have to UV unwrap it for Substance Painter, or the smart materials won't work. And so I decided to make these materials that are true smart materials, where they really don't need a UV map or anything like that. You can just drag and drop them and they will just work always, and I don't have to exit Blender. And yeah, that was my motivation for making these.